In the winter of 1997, risk-taking investors were dying to catch the dot-com wave, and no one wanted in on the action more than 23-year-old Brent Doonan.
I was with one of the big 6 accounting firms in Chicago right out of college. No complaints with that, but I looked at staying with corporate America or stepping out to carve out my own piece of the American pie.
So in February of 1998, Brent and a friend took a chance and launched a day trading firm in the young, vibrant city of Atlanta. And they knew it was sink or swim.
Day trading was a high-risk game. You could be destitute or deliriously wealthy in a single day.
We were young, ambitious, working 70 hours a week. It was a big risk to go in there and start from the ground up.
Brent knew he needed traders, good traders, with moxie and money. And one day, the perfect candidate came knocking.
A guy named Mark Barton came in and met with me in March of '98. He was a chemist by trade, but he had a lot of trading experience. Called himself a whale, meaning he traded blocks of 3,000 shares at a time, and that he didn't need any training. He was pretty much ready to go.
Brent couldn't help but be impressed by Mark. He was a big, happy-go-lucky, jovial, smart guy.
He knew how to trade, had plenty of money. He wanted to learn how to use our system, and he wanted to get going. Once he started, he was very, very aggressive. The guys in the office nicknamed him the Rocket because he was always just shooting to go to the sky.
One day he netted $106,000 in a single day of trading.
Mark seemed to be just what Alltech needed. He also seemed to be a consummate family man. Once the whistle blew, Mark Barton never socialized.
We would ask Mark, do you want to go to happy hour with us? And his response was typically, I either have church to go to, I've got Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts with my son. He always found an excuse, and it was typically motivated around his family.
So Brent thought it was especially strange when he overheard the guarded phone calls between Mark and his wife.
It was the same every day. He would call up, the phone would ring forever. Finally, an answering machine would come on, and he would say, "It's okay, honey, it's me, it's Mark, you can pick up the phone."
It almost seemed like Mark was regulating his wife's phone calls.
We all have our own quirks. You know, this guy's a great guy. He's handling his gains and losses. He comes in every day with a positive attitude. So he makes his wife wait until she knows that it's him to pick up the phone. I don't really feel as a business owner that I should get into a client's personal life to that level.
Brent knew what his priority was. Mark's performance at Alltech, which was top-notch.
He wasn't going to take no. He was going to keep going. He was going to shoot for the top, hence the name Rocket.
But even an optimistic go-getter has some bad days.
His trading had gotten a little bit out of control. And it's one of those things where you get behind a little bit and you try extra hard to make that up. And that's what happened to him.
But Mark never made it back up. And before long, he had dipped into company reserves to the tune of 11 grand, forcing Brent to cut him off.
I basically told him that he was going to have to make up that difference for us and that he would have to start with at least another $50,000 if he wanted to continue to trade with us.
So Mark left Alltech, but a few weeks later, he came back to make good on his debt.
It wasn't long, given his personality, that he gave us the $11,000 back and funded his account with another $50,000 to get started trading again.
Brent didn't know where Mark got the funds, but he welcomed his return. Unfortunately, the Rocket was still off course. And within 8 weeks, Mark owed Alltech again, this time more than $30,000.
Brent again asked Mark to leave Alltech. Barton said he understood, and maybe it was time for him to get back to work at being a chemist.
There were no hard feelings. There was a handshake and a vow that he would be back someday to repay the debt.
But 2 months went by with no word from Mark and no payment. Then on July 29, 1999, while Brent was in the conference room holding a meeting, the rocket suddenly appeared.
Mark Barton came through the main doors at Alltech, a little bit sweaty, and he began waving to get Brent's attention.
Mark said, "Come here, come here. You're really gonna love this." Smile on his face. I thought he was there to repay the $30,000 that he was in debt to us. I followed him out of the conference room and into my office, where my partner and my secretary were both seated. When he turned around, that happy, jovial look on his face was gone. It was just this straight-faced with these eyes that just seemed to look right through me. And he said simply, "Today is going to be visual."
Today is going to be visual. At that point, Mark crossed his arms like some B-movie bandito, and he pulls out 2 handguns.
At first, Brent thought Mark was pranking him.
I thought maybe they were cap guns or something, and then I saw the flash muzzle.
And he fires point blank at Brent, looking him in the eye the whole time.
The first one hit me in the chest, the second one in the arm. I laid there for a couple seconds and it was in intense pain. I started to see a pool of blood surround me, and I saw 2 gold shell casings right there. At that point, I just said to myself, "Oh my God, I just got shot."
And Barton was just getting started. While Brent lay there in agony, Mark shot Brent's partner and assistant, then continued onto the floor.
Mark began shooting methodically, yelling at one point, "I hope this doesn't ruin your trading day."
There was blood all over. I could hear him out there shooting people over and over and over, the screaming, the yelling, the commotion. I thought, do I lay there and pretend like I'm dead? Do I get up and try to make a run for it? There was a high probability that if I laid there and played dead, that he would come back and finish me off. So I stood up, and at that point I realized that he was in my office doorway with his back towards me, shooting out onto the office trading floor. I decided very quickly that I didn't have a choice, that if he turned around, I would be dead. My only option was to go for it. He had the gun aimed right at the woman's head, and I hit him as hard as I possibly could, and he pulled the trigger. It missed her. I made a run for it into the hallway, but he was able to shoot me in the back, in my left arm, and one that was just a grazer.
By now, Brent had been shot 5 times.
By the time I got into the hallway and started to make a run for it, it was a very surreal experience. The walls seemed to be closing in. I was trying to run as fast as I could, but it seemed like I was just not making headway, almost like when you're running in a dream. I was having a hard time standing, so I was using the walls to keep my balance. The lights were very bright. I couldn't hear a thing. I was just on a mission, an instinct of survival. Just get out of there. I didn't know what was going on behind me, if he was still in the office, if he was still in the building.
Just ahead was a service elevator in the hallway.
Brent knew the elevator was his one shot at escape.
I just started pushing the up button as fast as I could, just pushing, pushing, pushing. And a few seconds went by. I noticed one of our other traders, and right behind her, I saw him lift his gun and shoot her right there, point blank. At that point, the service elevator doors open. I jumped in there, started frantically pushing buttons.
Brent prayed for the doors to close.
I was just trying to go somewhere, anywhere.
But his attacker had other plans.
Barton appeared outside the elevator.
He raised his gun at me.
The monster was inches away.
On July 29th of 1999, young executive Brent Doonan boarded an elevator, but he wasn't headed to a meeting. He was trying to escape Mark Barton's deadly massacre after being shot 5 times.
I jumped in there, started frantically pushing buttons, and as the door started to close, it was Barton. He raised his gun at me. And just before he pulled the trigger, the elevator doors closed. I crouched down on all fours, just trying to keep some energy left to where when the doors opened, I had a fighting chance. Eventually, they opened in what felt like an eternity. I had only traveled up one floor to the third floor. I saw an office right next to the elevator.
The tenants on the third floor had no idea of the carnage going on below them.
I walked in there and I said, "Somebody please help me. I've been shot." And the response was, "Is this a joke?" I instructed them to lock the door and close the blinds and to get me out of the entryway, that it was likely that the shooter was still after me and that if he found me, we were all going to die.
Brent was dead serious and fading fast.
And that's when I fell to the ground.
While some of the office workers tended to Brent's wounds, others called 911, and the dispatcher assured them that help was on the way.
Help was on the way, but what no one knew was that it was being funneled somewhere else.
As horrifying as the events were at Alltech, the slaughter hadn't started there. Barton had actually begun his killing across Piedmont Avenue at Momentum Securities, where he had also lost money. The dispatchers had confused Alltech with Momentum Securities.
A terrible waiting game began for Brent as EMTs frantically tried to figure out where to go.
Brent was dying. As he lay bleeding on the floor, he asked someone to call his brother.
They were able to get him on the line. The phone cord would not reach, so the gal that was on the phone was relaying from my brother to me. He was saying, "Don't you die on me. You're a fighter. You're a champion. You keep going." One of the women in the office held my hand and started praying the Our Father over and over. My mouth was filling with blood. At that point, I had made a promise to myself that I didn't care how long that it took. I was in a severe amount of pain, but I was going to stay awake and I was going to fight as hard as I could. At that point, I was at peace with the situation and decided I was just going to hang on again and hope to last till the paramedics arrived.
Brent lay there for almost an hour, fearing Mark Barton could still rush in to finish him off.
The door burst open, and in came a paramedic and a man behind him. He said, "If you keep your eyes open and on me, you will live today."
When I first heard about it, I couldn't believe that my son had been shot. There are no words that can describe what a mother feels like to know that their child was hurting so bad. There's just no words.
As he was rushed to the hospital, Brent focused on the man's face, while police turned their sights on finding Mark Barton, whose body count was rising.
Between Alltech and Momentum, Mark Barton had shot 22 people. 9 of them died.
Worse, in the confusion of 2 shooting locations, the murderer slipped away.
Mark Barton had escaped the Alltech offices and walked across the parking lot and gotten into his minivan, disappeared into the streets of Atlanta. One of the largest manhunts in Georgia history locked down Atlanta and much of the state.
And that's when police went to Mark Barton's home and found another ghastly tableau.
They found the bludgeoned bodies of his wife and his 2 children, killed by a hammer in their beds.
As the manhunt intensified, Brent Doonan lay in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. The city of Atlanta was on high alert, with residents and officers alike terrified of who Mark Barton would target next.
The city was scared to death.
He was an explosive psychopath.
They didn't know how much ammunition he had. It was like a nightmare.
In July of 1999, 4 horrifying hours passed after Atlanta police had locked down the state and launched a fierce manhunt for heavily armed killer Mark Barton.
The whole city was just frightened to death. They didn't know how much ammunition he had. The news was on all the TVs in Atlanta. It was a horrible, horrible nightmare.
Finally, police cornered Barton at a gas station north of town and ordered him out of his van. Seconds later, a shot rang out.
Rather than be arrested, Mark Barton shot himself in the head.
Mark Barton died instantly. The nightmare was finally over.
I was so relieved when I found out that Mark killed himself. And we didn't have to worry whether he was going to pop up around the corner somewhere. I felt a huge relief that he was gone.
But Mark's suicide left behind many unanswered questions and several victims, including Brent Doonan, fighting for their lives.
He'd lost most of his body's blood supply, and most of his internal organs had been damaged.
It was devastating. When we arrived at the hospital, he was hooked up to all kinds of tubes. They told us that they didn't think that he would make it through the night.
Against all odds, Brent made it to the next morning, and that's when his family told him that Mark was dead.
I doubted whether they were telling me the truth or just trying to get me to keep fighting, so I asked one family member after another until I was satisfied that he was no longer after me.
But after relief, the realization of what had happened seemed unbearable.
You've made it, and you go through all these questions as to, why was it me? Why did I get through it, and why did this person die?
Brent racked his mind for any clues he might have missed.
You start looking back at signs to see what was out of the ordinary.
When he heard Mark killed his own wife and children, Brent remembered Mark's calls to his wife.
If I could find anything odd about him, it would be the way he dealt with his wife.
And as more information about who Mark Barton really was slowly came out, Brent and everyone else realized Mark's happy-go-lucky smile was hiding sinister secrets.
He was just not the person that I thought he was.
Just 6 years earlier, Mark had secretly taken out a life insurance policy on his first wife.
Not much later, his wife and her mother were found brutally bludgeoned to death in a camper trailer. Barton was the main suspect, but he was never arrested.
Forensics couldn't make a conclusive link, and Barton remained free and completely unapologetic. He cashed in on the policy and invested in the stock market.
The $150,000 that he had used in day trading was the result of insurance funds from the passing away of his first wife.
But Mark racked up more debt than income and ended up owing thousands, not just to Alltech, but also to Momentum Securities.
Mark Barton was caught in a downward spiral. Things had gotten out of his control. That might have something to do with his explosion of frustration at the end. He was lashing out at the world. Unfortunately, we'll never know exactly what was on Mark Barton's mind.
Mark Barton's motives died with him. Today, Brent lives in Kansas with his beloved family after years of emotional and physical turmoil.
Brent suffered from panic attacks. He went through PTSD with horrible nightmares, reliving those moments that he went through with Mark chasing him. Nobody will ever know the trauma that he felt inside of his body.
After a brief try at returning to Alltech, Brent concluded that investment banking was not the place for him anymore and sold his share of the business.
It was very difficult to be back in there. You're physically scarred, emotionally scarred forever. You never go back to life as usual.
But Brent has found a new purpose in life. His 9-year-old son.
He's the center of my universe and has really, really helped me get through not only this, but gives me a reason to be here.
It's just amazing that he could go through all of this and survive and be a happy young man and have a bright outlook on life.
I would consider this not a tragedy, but in the end, this is a story of living.
When it came to matters of the heart, Donna Kohler was a bit of a late bloomer.
In high school, I was kind of a loner and didn't date, didn't have a lot of friends, didn't go out and do a lot of things.
As an 18-year-old college freshman in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, Donna had never been in love. But she hoped that would change.
I was hoping not only to get my degree, but to meet somebody and end up in a relationship.
In the winter of 1970, Donna's wish was granted. One evening at a college party, she found something much more interesting than books to study. His name was Jim Bowley, a handsome student 2 years Donna's senior.
I sat down next to him in the living room and we started talking. He was going for his teaching degree, as was I, and it was just real easy, real comfortable to talk to him.
I think it was their love of being an educator that brought them together. They pretty much were inseparable from that point forward.
He had a great sense of humor. He had beautiful, short, brown, wavy hair and real pretty hazel eyes and just nice-looking guy.
Donna and Jim fell hard and fast, and by the following fall, there was no doubt the lovebirds were made for each other. In the summer of 1972, Donna and Jim married in a beautiful Catholic church.
I had no doubts. This was the man I wanted to be with, and I was ready to spend the rest of my life with him.
After the wedding, the newlyweds set about building their lives together in Sikeston, Missouri. Jim started teaching 6th grade history, and in 1975, Donna landed a teaching job of her own. 1 year later, the couple welcomed baby Steve into the world. And while Donna was overjoyed, she was also overwhelmed.
Being a mother and having a full-time job would get to be a little much, taking care of the baby, taking care of the laundry, and then trying to get supper started at the same time.
But Jim, ever the perfect husband, had a solution.
Jim offered to go ahead and do the cooking, and that was a big load off my mind because then I wouldn't have to worry about getting the food on the table.
By the time the couple had their second son in October 1979, Donna and Jim were well into the swing of things on the home front. But at work, Jim felt stifled by his lack of upward mobility. So in the fall of 1987, when he found a job as a middle school guidance counselor in St. Louis, a move seemed like the perfect plan.
I was really happy because my parents still lived up here, and it was nice to know that I was going to be close to them.
Donna knew she couldn't have asked for a better partner than Jim. But over the next 6 years, their perfect life together would become tainted. And Donna would learn that the most important decision of her life would also be the most lethal. On the morning of September 25th, 1993, Donna woke knowing something was seriously wrong.
I could just hardly move. I was extremely weak, and I was turning jaundiced and just felt horrible. I just really felt like I was dying.
Jim rushed Donna to the hospital.
Jim brought a wheelchair out, and I got into the wheelchair, and the last thing I remember was going through the hospital doors.
Everyone knew that Donna's situation was grave, but no one realized that things were about to get even worse.
Something was not right. I was scared.
At that point, my whole life fell apart.
In the fall of 1987, 6 years before Donna Kohler was fighting for her life, she and her husband Jim Boley and their 2 sons moved to St. Louis to further Jim's education career. But Jim's job as a school counselor brought new responsibilities.
Jim's new teaching job kept him away from home a lot because he did some coaching with baseball and football.
Her husband was a busy man, but that didn't bother Donna one bit.
It was bringing in money, and we had a lot of bills to pay. It really didn't hurt our marriage. We were both very happy, and things just seemed to flow real nicely.
In fact, as Jim turned 40, Donna noticed that he seemed friskier than ever.
He started to let his hair grow longer. He went out and bought colored underwear and bought a sports car convertible. I didn't know if it was the midlife crisis or what it was, but I was enjoying it.
But there was something Donna wasn't enjoying. In the summer of 1991, her health started going downhill.
I thought I was coming down with a sinus infection. My stomach just didn't feel good. Then it progressed to where I was having stomach cramps and throwing up, and I just didn't know what was going on. I first went to my regular doctor, and he gave me antibiotics.
When antibiotics didn't help, doctors concluded irritable bowel syndrome might be causing Donna's debilitating stomach pain.
When my doctor gave me a diagnosis, I felt relieved. And I thought, okay, we've got a name to what I have. We've got pills to help me. I can work with this.
And Jim was the perfect nurse when the pain was at its worst.
Jim would be very attentive. He would always want to try to fix me something to eat that I could keep down, and was always taking care of me.
He would prepare all her food for her and all her meals. And whenever she would be in a lot of pain, he would say, "Oh, sweetie, I'm sorry that you feel so bad. Let me go make you something to eat."
As the school year wound down, it seemed Donna's symptoms did too. Until the summer of 1992, when Donna became ill once again while gearing up for a new school year.
My symptoms had come back even stronger. So I went to my gynecologist to see if maybe there was something else going on that I didn't know about.
And sure enough, Donna's gynecologist found a large cyst on one of her ovaries. He recommended surgery to remove it, and Donna scheduled the procedure. But she found herself in the hospital sooner than planned.
Right before I was supposed to have the surgery, I got seriously ill. My fever spiked to 105. I got delirious. Jim took me to the hospital, and they ended up packing my body in ice to try to bring my fever down. I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I lost 2 days. The doctors weren't quite sure what had happened to me.
It seemed surgery was still Donna's best option, but the procedure did not go well. While doctors were able to remove the cyst, Donna suffered an unexpected reaction to the anesthesia and ended up on life support.
I was terrified. I was afraid she was going to die.
For 10 days, Donna's life hung in the balance, while doctors conducted test after test, including a heavy metal screening for poison, but the results were negative.
The doctors didn't know what was causing it.
But miraculously, Donna's health improved quickly in her doctor's care, and she was released from the hospital on October 23rd. But just as those problems were subsiding, new ones were brewing at home.
I'd been home from the hospital for about 3 or 4 days, and I was home alone. Jim was at school, kids were at school, and I got a call from a woman, and she would not give her name.
Instead, the woman gave Donna some devastating news about Jim.
I was hysterical, and I just knew that there was no way that that could be him.
The more I learned, the more I realized I didn't really know. My father.
In the fall of 1992, a few days after her discharge from the hospital, Donna Kohler was hoping her troubles were over. until she received a disturbing phone call from a strange woman.
She told me that my husband was running around with a woman, and I told her that she didn't know what she was talking about.
But the woman insisted she was telling the truth. She told Donna to check a telephone dating service where Jim had created an ad.
When I listened to the message, it was Jim saying that he was an ivory man looking for an ebony woman. And I just lost it. I slammed the phone down, started crying, called my mom. I was hysterical. I didn't know what to do.
When Jim got home from work, Donna immediately cornered him.
I looked at him and I said, "We have to talk." And I told him about hearing that message. And the first thing out of his mouth was, "Oh, is that thing still on?"
Jim quickly admitted that he had created the ad, but he had done it as a favor for a coworker.
He said, "You know the other counselor at school, how he's got the speech impediment." He said he wanted to put a message on the dating service, but he didn't want to use his voice, so I offered to put the message on for him.
The explanation made sense. Donna had met the coworker with the speech impediment, so it was plausible he'd asked Jim for help with the ladies.
Jim told me he was sorry that I had to hear that, and that he would take that off immediately. He said, "I'm really sorry, and I would never do anything to hurt you."
Donna decided to let the matter go. She had other things on her mind. Her health had begun to go downhill again.
It didn't take too long for me to start having the same symptoms that I had been having, and I was scared.
Nobody knew what was wrong with her. I was confused to watch my mother going through what she was going through. It was a very painful experience.
At their wits' end, Donna's doctors suspected lupus might be the culprit and prescribed new medication. Although she was in agony, Donna felt lucky to have true love on her side.
Jim was still very attentive. He would still come home and try to fix me something that I could eat, and was always loving and caring for me.
Still, despite Jim's TLC, Donna continued getting sicker with each passing day.
I was not able to keep anything down. So he gave me a glass of milk, and when I got done drinking it, it had like pink residue in the bottom of the glass. And he said, "Well, that's that discount milk. You know it gets like that sometimes." I never remembered my milk being pink, but I was so out of it.
On September 25th, 1993, Donna woke feeling worse than ever.
I just felt that I was dying. I was extremely weak. I couldn't keep any food down. And I was turning jaundiced and just felt horrible.
Donna begged Jim to take her to the hospital, but Jim suggested Donna wait for her lupus meds to kick in.
So I called my mom, and I told her that Jim didn't want to take me to the hospital. And she said, "If he isn't going to take you, I will."
The threat worked. Jim finally rushed his sick wife to the hospital. Once there, Donna fell into a fit of seizures. Her heart stopped between 5 and 7 times. Doctors were able to bring her back, but the prognosis was grave. Donna couldn't speak, and she was now paralyzed from the nose down.
She had all these tubes hooked up to her. She was on a ventilator. She couldn't move. She was unconscious. I had a hard time being in the room seeing her like that.
When I woke up and I realized that I was paralyzed, I didn't know if I was ever going to have my life back. I would lay there in the bed and try to move my arm, and my brain was telling me that my arm was moving, but it wasn't moving.
Doctors were baffled, but everything was about to change. It all started with one of Donna's nurses.
I was charge nurse that evening, and by the end of the night, Donna was critical. And I usually didn't go down to the MRI with them, but she was so critical at this time that I decided to go down with her.
While Donna waited on a gurney in the hallway, Juanita went back to Donna's hospital room for her chart.
Jim was in the room. He was talking on the phone,
And what Juanita overheard him say was jaw-dropping.
I was shocked. I remember standing there, did I really hear that?
I figured there were two options available. One's attempted suicide or two, attempted murder.
In the fall of 1993, Donna Kohler was at death's door. The situation was dire, and doctors had no idea what was wrong with her until one day that September when an attentive nurse overheard a shocking phone call.
Jim was talking on the phone. He was talking in sexually explicit conversation with somebody on the other line. It was just disgusting, especially when your wife is dying. And then I overheard him say arsenic. I was shocked. I remember standing there, did I really hear that?
Arsenic is a poison commonly found in pesticides. In humans, it can cause a breakdown of normal bodily functions.
It was like the perfect storm and everything came together. I talked to the supervisor and I was told, you need to be sure about what you heard. You know, you can be sued, get your license taken away.
But Juanita was certain of what she had heard. She informed Donna's doctors immediately.
I couldn't live with myself if she died.
Doctors quickly issued another heavy metal screening, this time from Donna's hair, and the results were staggering.
It was like 7 to 10 times the lethal amount of arsenic that was eventually found in her system.
Doctors moved Donna to a secure section of the hospital and immediately called the police.
The hospital told me that Donna was paralyzed from the neck down and not able to speak. So I figured there were two options available. One's attempted suicide or two, attempted murder.
Police were able to question Donna using a letterboard where she blinked one letter at a time.
She started crying and was very upset, and that's when she told me that she thought Jim was involved, that he had given her milk with a pink residue in it.
Investigators immediately brought Jim in for questioning, but he denied everything.
He said she was having hallucinations. He would always redirect blame. He would always try to change the subject.
Convinced Jim wasn't telling the truth, detectives hammered him. But when Jim finally broke, he told police another whopper.
Jim finally admitted his guilt, but even during his admission, he tried to make it nice. He said he poisoned her with the arsenic just to make her sick. His intent, according to him, was to make Donna sick so she'd stay home from work, and then he could stay home and they could have some quality time together. I thought it was a bunch of bull.
In fact, as detectives dug deeper, they discovered that the respected school counselor and sports coach was leading a double life.
He had safe deposit box in his name, a cell phone in his name. He stayed at hotels under assumed names, used 2 different dating sites to date different women. When she was sick, he'd be with someone else, checking into a motel. It was obvious that he wasn't concerned about Donna. He had $600,000 in life insurance on her.
My whole life fell apart. I realized that all of this illness had been caused by my husband, and he was the one that was always taking care of me. He was the one that I trusted. It just really upset me that our whole marriage was a lie.
On October 10th, 1993, police arrested Jim Bowley and charged him with first-degree assault and armed criminal action. In January 1995, Jim Bowley went to trial, and Donna testified against him.
I made sure that I looked at him. I wanted him to see that I had made it. And I wanted him to see that I was going to put him away.
On February 1st, a jury found Jim Bowley guilty as charged. He received 2 consecutive life sentences. Jim showed no remorse. And after the trial, Donna's divorce from her husband was final.
I often wonder what part of our marriage was really true. Was there any love? Or did this start at the very beginning? He was just going to stay married, have a couple kids, and then try to get rid of me.
Today, after a long road of rehab and therapy, Donna can walk, talk, and teach once again.
I would tell my students that they were not allowed to use the word can't in my room, because if I had stopped anywhere along the way and said, I can't do this, I wouldn't be where I am today.
She'll never be able to have the fine motor control skills that she had before the poisoning. And I think that her living is the best revenge that she could possibly ever get on him.
And even though it took years for Donna to rebuild her faith in men, she's since found happiness with a new husband.
I've been married 11 years, and my marriage is strong. I still enjoy going out and doing karaoke. I can still dance. I've gotten to be a pretty good cook now that I'm doing it on my own.
The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary Parisian quiet that falls between sirens and late-night traffic, but a heavier silence, the kind that presses against the ears and makes people stop walking, makes them turn their heads without knowing why. It was the morning of a gray autumn day in 1995, and in a narrow arrondissement where cafes were already opening their shutters, something had gone wrong. A door stood ajar. Inside, time had stopped. By nightfall, the word cold case would not yet exist in headlines. But the story that would later earn that label had already begun its slow, unforgiving descent into mystery. Police arrived with the confidence of routine. A missing person report had come in late, delayed by assumptions and polite excuses. An adult disappearance, no immediate signs of struggle, no screaming neighbors, no broken windows. The kind of call that rarely ends in panic. Yet the apartment told a different story. Shoes by the door, aligned too neatly. A half-finished cup of coffee, cold, untouched. Curtains drawn, as if the occupant had expected to return within minutes. There were no obvious stains, no overturned furniture, no chaos. Just absence. And absence, investigators would soon learn, can be louder than violence. The victim, known, liked, unremarkable in the way that makes people feel safe, had lived a predictable life. Regular hours. Familiar routes. A face recognized by shopkeepers, neighbors, a postal worker who could recall the sound of the door opening each afternoon at the same time. This was not someone who vanished on impulse. This was not a person who ran. That assumption settled quickly, almost too quickly, and it shaped everything that followed. In the early notes, officers wrote words that would later haunt the file. Voluntary disappearance possible. It was a sentence that bought time. And time, in cases like this, is dangerous. As the hours stretched into days, Paris kept moving. Traffic roared across bridges. Newspapers stacked fresh editions. But in the neighborhood, something shifted. People spoke in lower voices. They replayed memories that suddenly felt important. An argument overheard through thin walls, a stranger in the stairwell, footsteps at an unusual hour. Each detail arrived too late. Like witnesses stepping forward after the curtain had already fallen. Detectives canvassed the area, but the trail felt thin, brittle. No confirmed sightings. No withdrawals from bank accounts. No calls placed. It was as if the victim had stepped out of the city entirely, erased in the space between one ordinary moment and the next. Then came the first strange detail. In the apartment's trash bin, buried beneath ordinary refuse, investigators found something that didn't belong. A small object, unremarkable at first glance, overlooked in the initial sweep. It wasn't incriminating. It wasn't dramatic. But it was wrong. It was out of place in a way that nagged at the mind. Logged and bagged, it would later become a point of obsession, though in 1995 it earned little attention. Paris police had no shortage of cases. Files stacked high. Leads demanded quick tree-off. And this one, this quiet disappearance, slid down the priority list with unsettling ease. The family refused to accept the official tone. They pushed back against the language of choice and freedom. They insisted on patterns, on habits that could not be broken so cleanly. They spoke of fear, of something unspoken, of phone calls that ended abruptly. Their frustration met a familiar wall. Without a body, without blood, without proof, the system hesitated. The case drifted. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The words Matt Tichbian, mysterious disappearance, began to circulate, whispered first, then printed in small columns that never reached the front page. Behind closed doors, detectives argued. Some believed the city itself had swallowed the victim, that anonymity was Paris's cruelest weapon. Others suspected something more deliberate, something hidden behind manners and locked doors. But suspicions need anchors, and anchors were scarce. Surveillance cameras were rare. Digital footprints barely existed. What remained were human memories, fragile, inconsistent, already fading. Each interview added noise rather than clarity. Each lead collapsed under scrutiny. The case was still warm, still breathing, but already losing its pulse. Years passed. The file gathered dust, then weight. New officers glanced at it with curiosity, then moved on. It joined the long, uncomfortable shelf of unresolved cases, a quiet embarrassment in an otherwise efficient system. The neighborhood changed. Shops closed. New residents moved in, unaware that the walls around them had once listened to unanswered questions. The family aged. Hope thinned. And Paris, vast and indifferent, absorbed the story into its undercurrent of forgotten lives. Then, almost by accident, everything shifted. In the early 2000s, during an internal review sparked by unrelated procedural reforms, a junior prosecutor requested old files for digitization. The Paris 1995 disappearance resurfaced, not because of new evidence, but because of an administrative checkbox. A routine task, a mundane process. And yet, when the file was reopened, something felt off. Notes contradicted each other. Timelines overlapped in ways they shouldn't. An interview summary referenced a statement that was never transcribed. It was the kind of inconsistency that only appears when a case has been handled too quickly or not quickly enough. Buried deeper was that object from the trash bin. Re-examined with modern eyes, it raised new questions. Why had it been there? Why had it been dismissed? And more importantly, why had no one followed up on its origin? The prosecutor flagged it, sent a request for clarification, and waited. What came back was silence. Not the heavy silence of an empty apartment, but the bureaucratic silence of missing documentation. A gap in the record. A missing report. Evidence without a trail. That was when the phrase hidden evidence entered the conversation for the first time. The revelation didn't explode. It crept. It spread through offices and hallways in cautious whispers. If this had been overlooked, what else had been ignored? The file was pulled again, this time with intent. Witness statements were reread. Margins scribbled decades earlier now seemed loaded with implication. One name appeared more often than remembered, always peripheral, always dismissed as irrelevant. A neighbor, a colleague, someone who had been present without ever becoming central. The kind of figure that disappears into the background unless someone decides to look harder. Prosecutors felt a familiar chill, the one that comes when confidence turns into doubt. If the early assumptions were wrong, the entire investigation had been built on sand. The idea of a voluntary disappearance began to crack. Patterns emerged where none had been acknowledged before. Missed appointments. A sudden change in routine days before vanishing. A phone call placed and never returned. Each detail alone was nothing. Together, they suggested pressure. Fear. A timeline that no longer felt accidental. Still, reopening a case meant confronting institutional failure. It meant admitting that Paris, for all its resources, had let someone slip through. The decision was not taken lightly. Meetings stretched late. Legal risks were weighed. The family was contacted cautiously, warned not to expect miracles. But the word cold case now carried a different weight. It wasn't just a label for old mysteries. It was an accusation, a suggestion that something had been allowed to freeze before it was truly understood. When the family learned that prosecutors were re-examining the file, reactions were mixed. Relief collided with anger. Hope resurfaced, sharp and painful. They asked the same question they had asked for years. Why now? No one had a satisfying answer. Technology had changed. Standards had shifted. People had moved on. But beneath the official explanations lay a simpler truth. Someone, somewhere, had finally looked closely enough. As the first subpoenas were drafted, as names were quietly placed back under scrutiny, the city remained unaware that an old wound had been reopened. No press conference. No headlines yet. Just a handful of officials staring at yellowed pages, realizing that the silence from 1995 had not been empty at all. It had been hiding something. And somewhere in that silence, the truth waited, patient, unresolved, and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined when a door was left ajar on a quiet Paris morning. The silence did not stay contained within the file. Once it was disturbed, it began to leak into meetings, into late-night phone calls, into the uneasy pauses between sentences when prosecutors realized they were no longer discussing an abstract disappearance, but a sequence of decisions that had real consequences. The first internal memo was careful, almost apologetic in tone, noting inconsistencies requiring clarification. But beneath that language was urgency, a sense that the case had not gone cold on its own, that it had been cooled, deliberately or not, by assumptions that now looked fragile. Re-interviewing witnesses after so many years is an exercise in erosion. Memories soften, details blur. People remember feelings more clearly than facts. And yet, when detectives began knocking on doors again, they encountered something unexpected, not confusion, but recognition. Several witnesses reacted not with surprise, but with relief, as if they had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions, even decades later. One neighbor admitted that certain things had never sat right, that the official story had felt too neat. Another confessed to withholding a detail out of fear of being wrong, of causing trouble, of becoming entangled in something darker than a missing person report. The city itself had changed, but the building had not. The stairwell still smelled faintly of dust and old paint. The same narrow angles, the same blind spots. Investigators walked the route again, counting steps, timing distances, standing where the victim would have stood on an ordinary evening. That exercise alone cracked the theory of voluntary disappearance. The logistics didn't align. Leaving unnoticed would have required luck bordering on orchestration. Someone would have seen something. Someone would have heard something. Unless, of course, the exit had not been voluntary at all. Attention returned to the hours before the disappearance, long treated as uneventful. Phone records, limited, but revealing, were reanalyzed. One call stood out, not because of its content, which remained unknown, but because of its timing. It occurred late, later than usual, and it lasted longer than expected. It was the final outgoing call. The number belonged to someone already interviewed in 1995, dismissed quickly, described as cooperative and not relevant. That description now felt insufficient. Cooperation can be performance. Relevance can be misjudged. The prosecutors requested permission to dig deeper, to pull employment records, travel histories, anything that might reconstruct movements from a time before digital surveillance made such work routine. Each request carried weight. Each signature implied that the state was willing to question its own past conclusions. Resistance came quietly, from legal advisors worried about precedent, from departments protective of their reputations. But the inconsistencies were too stark to ignore. The file, once dormant, now pulsed with unresolved energy. What shocked the team most was not what they found, but what they didn't. Entire sections of the investigation appeared thin, almost skeletal. Follow-ups that should have been standard were missing. A witness mentioned in passing was never recontacted. A timeline jumped forward hours without explanation. These gaps suggested haste, not malice. Yet haste can be just as destructive. It creates shadows where clarity should exist, and shadows invite speculation. One particular gap drew attention. A short window of time on the night of the disappearance, barely 40 minutes, during which the victim's whereabouts were unaccounted for. In 1995, that window had been brushed aside as inconsequential. Now it loomed large. 40 minutes is enough for decisions to be made, for confrontations to escalate, for plans to fail. 40 minutes is where crimes often hide. Reconstruction efforts began cautiously. Investigators mapped possible routes, compared them against witness statements that had once been dismissed as contradictory. When layered together, those contradictions formed a pattern. Two witnesses described hearing raised voices, but at slightly different times. A third recalled footsteps on the stairs, but could not say from which direction. Alone, each account was weak. Together, they suggested movement, someone entering, someone leaving, someone not accounted for in the original narrative. The prosecutors felt the case tightening around a central discomfort. The early classification of the disappearance had shaped everything that followed. Once the idea of choice was introduced, urgency dissolved. Evidence was handled, not chased. Leads were noted, not pursued. The system had done what systems often do. It had accepted the path of least resistance. And now, decades later, that path was being re-examined under harsher light. The family was brought in again, this time not as hopeful petitioners, but as necessary participants. They were shown portions of the file they had never seen. They were asked questions they had answered years earlier, now reframed, sharper. Their reactions were telling, not shocked, but vindicated. They spoke of instincts dismissed as emotion, of moments they had replayed endlessly in their minds. They described a sense of being watched after the disappearance, subtle but persistent, a feeling they had buried because no one seemed interested in hearing it. That detail sent a ripple through the room. Being watched implies proximity. It implies someone invested in silence. The idea was uncomfortable, but it aligned with another emerging thread. The possibility that the person responsible had not fled, had not vanished into anonymity, but had remained close, protected by familiarity and by the very assumptions that deflected suspicion. As whispers of a reopened investigation began circulating within legal circles, anxiety grew. Prosecutors understood the stakes. If hidden evidence existed, if negligence could be demonstrated, the repercussions would extend beyond one case. Careers, reputations, public trust. Yet the alternative, doing nothing, now felt worse. The truth, whatever it was, had been waiting too long. Late one evening, a box arrived from storage, mislabeled and nearly forgotten. Inside were items logged hastily in the mid-90s, preserved but never truly examined. Among them was that small object from the trash bin, now accompanied by a handwritten note that raised eyebrows. The note referenced an interview that did not appear anywhere else in the file. A name, a date, a time. The implication was clear. Something had been said, something potentially important, and it had never been integrated into the official narrative. The prosecutors stared at the note in silence. This was no longer about reinterpretation. This was about omission. Whether accidental or deliberate, it had altered the course of the investigation. The discovery shifted the tone of the case from curiosity to alarm. Requests were made. Archives were searched. Retired officers were contacted, some reluctant, others surprisingly eager to talk. One former detective admitted, off the record, that there had been pressure to close cases quickly in that era. Resources were stretched. Public attention was elsewhere. A disappearance without spectacle did not command urgency. That admission did not excuse the gaps, but it explained the environment in which they formed. Understanding that context made the prosecutor's task heavier, not lighter. They were not just chasing a suspect. They were untangling history. As night settled over Paris, the city remained oblivious to the fact that an old mystery was shedding its skin. The case was no longer frozen. It was unstable, volatile. Every rediscovered document threatened to reframe the story entirely. And beneath it all lay a growing realization. The truth had not been buried deep. It had been set aside, quietly, in the belief that it would never be needed again. Now it was needed. And as the investigation edged closer to the people who had once stood just outside the spotlight, the silence that began in 1995 grew louder, heavier, charged with the promise that it was about to break. By the time the first retired officers agreed to speak on record, the atmosphere surrounding the case had changed completely. What had once been treated as an administrative curiosity now carried the unmistakable gravity of a reckoning. Interviews were scheduled discreetly, away from the glare of internal politics, in rooms where the air felt thick with things left unsaid. Some memories surfaced reluctantly, others spilled out with surprising urgency, as if the years had only sharpened the need to unburden them. One former investigator recalled the night of the disappearance with unsettling clarity, not the facts, but the feeling. He described an unease that settled in his stomach when he walked through the apartment, an intuition that something was wrong despite the lack of visible disorder. He remembered arguing, briefly, that the case should be treated as suspicious from the outset. And he remembered being overruled. The reasoning had been pragmatic, almost casual. No blood, no signs of forced entry, no immediate threat to public safety. Move on. Allocate resources elsewhere. That decision, he admitted, had never fully left him. As these recollections accumulated, prosecutors began to see how fragile the original narrative had been. It wasn't built on certainty, it was built on convenience. The assumption of voluntary disappearance had acted like a lens, distorting everything viewed through it. Details that contradicted the idea were softened. Questions that pointed elsewhere were deferred. Over time, the lens hardened into doctrine, and the doctrine into neglect. The focus returned again and again to that narrow time window on the night in question. Investigators reconstructed it minute by minute, overlaying witness statements with physical constraints, elevator logs, stairwell acoustics, the geometry of doors and corridors. What emerged was not a clean sequence, but a convergence. Multiple paths crossed within that 40-minute span. People moved through shared spaces without realizing their movements would later become critical. The building, once a passive backdrop, became an active participant in the mystery. A witness who had been barely acknowledged in 1995 was contacted again. She was older now, more cautious, but also less concerned about being dismissed. She described hearing a voice she did not recognize, low and insistent, followed by a pause she had never been able to explain. At the time, she had assumed it was an argument between acquaintances, none of her business. When officers asked why she hadn't pushed harder to be heard, she gave a simple answer. No one had seemed interested. Her account did not fit the prevailing theory, so it had been filed away, effectively silenced. This pattern repeated itself with disturbing consistency. Each overlooked detail pointed in the same direction, not toward a single dramatic error, but toward a culture of selective attention. The prosecutors began documenting not just new findings, but missed opportunities. They built a parallel timeline. What was known then, what could have been known, and what was ignored. It was a timeline that told a different story, one where the disappearance was neither sudden nor inexplicable, but the result of escalating tension that went unrecognized. Financial records added another layer. While there was no evidence of planning to flee, there were signs of strain, unusual transactions, modest but telling, in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Nothing illegal, nothing sensational, but enough to suggest pressure. Combined with testimony from colleagues, it painted a picture of someone increasingly anxious, increasingly cautious, someone who might have confided in the wrong person or trusted someone who did not deserve it. Attention narrowed to a small circle of individuals connected through routine rather than intimacy. They were not obvious suspects. They were the people one encounters without thinking twice. Neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances who drift in and out of daily life. In 1995, none of them had triggered alarms. In hindsight, their proximity felt less benign. One name, in particular, resurfaced repeatedly, always tangentially, always just outside the scope of formal suspicion. The prosecutors noticed how often that name appeared in the margins of reports, never underlined, never highlighted. When questioned again, this individual remained composed, cooperative, almost rehearsed. Their version of events had not changed in decades, which at first seemed reassuring. But consistency can be a mask. Investigators noted how carefully words were chosen, how answers circled questions rather than landing on them. There were no contradictions to exploit, only omissions. And omissions, when repeated, begin to form their own kind of statement. The decision to escalate the investigation brought consequences. Media interest stirred, cautiously at first. The phrase, Paris 1995 cold case, began appearing in specialized legal columns, then in broader outlets. Each mention applied pressure, not just on potential suspects, but on the institutions involved. Prosecutors received calls urging restraint, reminders of the difficulty of proving anything so long after the fact. They were warned about expectations, about reopening wounds that might never heal. But the momentum was irreversible. Too many questions had been asked. Too many answers had proven insufficient. Late one night, while reviewing the digitized file, a junior analyst noticed something that had escaped everyone else. A discrepancy in dates tied to that mysterious interview referenced in the handwritten note. The date did not align with the officer assigned to the case at the time. It aligned with someone else, someone who had not been officially listed as part of the investigative team. That revelation reframed the omission entirely. This was not just about haste. This was about control of information. Further digging revealed that the interview had taken place off-site, informally, and that its contents had been summarized verbally rather than documented. Why? No one could say with certainty, but the implications were severe. An undocumented interview is a black hole in an investigation. It swallows context, intent, nuance. Whatever had been said in that room was now inaccessible, filtered only through memory and inference. As prosecutors debated how to proceed, a sense of urgency took hold. Time was no longer a passive enemy. It was an active one. Witnesses were aging. Memories were fading. And yet, paradoxically, the delay had also created cracks, moments where people felt less protected by silence, less bound by old loyalties. Anonymous tips began arriving, vague but suggestive. One message mentioned fear. Another mentioned a warning given and ignored. None were immediately actionable, but they reinforced the sense that the truth had been circulating quietly all along. The case, once defined by absence, was now defined by accumulation. Each rediscovered detail added weight, pressing down on a narrative that had been too light to hold reality. Prosecutors felt the tension rising, not toward resolution, but toward confrontation, between past and present, between what had been accepted and what could no longer be denied. And as they prepared to take the next step, to move from review to accusation, one thought lingered in every mind. If the disappearance had never been voluntary, if the evidence had been there all along, then the real mystery was not how someone vanished in Paris in 1995, but how the city had managed, for so long, not to see it. By the time prosecutors authorized the first covert background checks, the case had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer a matter of revisiting history. It was an act of risk. Someone, somewhere, might realize that old certainties were being dismantled, that the protective fog of time was thinning. That awareness hung over every decision. Names were spoken carefully. Requests were phrased narrowly. Even within the legal team, information moved in controlled currents, as if the truth itself required safeguarding. The individual whose name kept resurfacing was not dramatic, not volatile, not someone who fit the public's idea of danger. Their life had followed a stable arc, employment uninterrupted, address unchanged for years, relationships quiet, unremarkable. That normalcy had been their camouflage. In 1995, it made them invisible. Now, under renewed scrutiny, it felt deliberate. The prosecutors noted how proximity to the victim had been minimized in early reports, described as incidental rather than habitual. Language matters. Incidental contact can be ignored. Habitual contact demands explanation. Investigators traced routines from the mid-90s with forensic patience. Work schedules, commute patterns, cafes frequented out of convenience rather than preference. These details, once too ordinary to record, now became clues. The victim and this peripheral figure crossed paths more often than acknowledged, sometimes daily. There were moments of overlap that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Shared elevators, repeated encounters in transitional spaces, hallways, entrances, thresholds where conversations can begin and end without witnesses. The 40-minute gap returned again, relentless. Prosecutors built scenarios, not as accusations, but as tests. Could a conversation escalate? Could a confrontation be contained within those walls? Could someone leave without attracting attention? Each scenario was measured against physical reality, against human behavior. The answers were unsettlingly consistent. Yes, it was possible, not guaranteed, but possible enough to demand serious consideration. When confronted with updated timelines, the individual remained calm. They acknowledged contact, but framed it as minimal, courteous, forgettable. They denied any argument, any tension. Their effect never shifted, even when presented with inconsistencies so small they seemed trivial. Differences in phrasing, minor adjustments in recollection. To an untrained observer, it might have appeared convincing. To seasoned interrogators, it read as control. Emotion was present, but carefully rationed. At the same time, pressure mounted elsewhere. Prosecutors requested access to archived internal communications from the mid-90s, hoping to understand how decisions had been made. What they found was sparse, but telling. Emails referenced keeping things simple, avoiding unnecessary escalation. No overt wrongdoing, no conspiracy, just a pattern of risk aversion. In a system designed to manage volume, anomalies are liabilities. The safest choice is often to assume nothing is wrong. That realization reframed the notion of hidden evidence. It was not hidden in the sense of being secreted away. It had been visible, but unvalued. Information loses power when no one believes it matters. In that sense, the evidence had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for a context in which it could speak. The family, now cautiously hopeful, were kept informed but not indulged. Prosecutors understood the cruelty of expectation. They explained the legal thresholds, the burden of proof, the difficulty of transforming suspicion into charge. Still, the family sensed a shift. For the first time in years, officials spoke in specifics. Names were acknowledged. Gaps were admitted. The tone had changed from deflection to engagement. Then came the unexpected complication. A secondary figure emerged, someone who had been tangential to both the victim and the primary person of interest. This individual had moved abroad shortly after the disappearance, a fact noted but never pursued. At the time, it had been attributed to opportunity, to life continuing. Now it felt abrupt. Records showed a sudden resignation, a hasty relocation, minimal forwarding information. When contacted years later, they expressed surprise at being reached, but also relief. They had, it seemed, been waiting for this call. Their account did not introduce a dramatic confession. Instead, it introduced context. They described an atmosphere of tension, subtle but persistent, in the weeks before the disappearance. They spoke of conversations that stopped when others entered the room, of glances that lingered too long. Most strikingly, they recalled a warning given indirectly, couched as concern rather than accusation. At the time, it had seemed paranoid. Now it sounded prescient. This testimony complicated the narrative without clarifying it. Prosecutors now faced overlapping threads, each suggestive, none definitive. The risk of confirmation bias loomed. They reminded themselves constantly, suspicion is not proof. Yet the accumulation was undeniable. Too many people recalled unease. Too many details aligned only when viewed together. As media interest intensified, the language surrounding the case shifted again. Headlines used words like exposed, overlooked, systemic failure. Prosecutors bristled at the simplification, but they could not deny the underlying truth. Public pressure accelerated internal timelines. Decisions that might have taken months were now required in weeks. Every move carried potential fallout. Behind the scenes, legal teams debated strategy. Was there enough to justify formal charges? Or would premature action collapse the case entirely? The absence of a body remained the central obstacle. Without it, prosecutors would need an airtight narrative built entirely on circumstantial evidence. That was possible, but perilous. One misstep could reinforce the very failures they were trying to correct. Meanwhile, the person of interest continued their life unchanged. They went to work. They greeted neighbors. They displayed no outward sign of alarm. That calm, once reassuring, now felt unsettling. Prosecutors wondered whether it was ignorance or confidence. Had they noticed the renewed attention? Had they prepared for it? Or did they still believe the past was immovable? The question sharpened when investigators uncovered a final detail from the old file, one that had been misfiled under an unrelated case number. It was a brief note, almost an aside, referencing a smell reported by a witness. Unusual, fleeting, dismissed as environmental. In 1995, it had meant nothing. Now, contextualized within the building's layout and ventilation, it suggested something else entirely. Something temporary. Something that could disappear as easily as it arrived. The note electrified the team. It did not prove a crime. It did not even confirm wrongdoing. But it bridged a gap between suspicion and possibility. It suggested an action that could explain absence without spectacle, an event that left no trace strong enough to force immediate recognition. As prosecutors sat with that realization, the weight of the case pressed in. This was no longer about correcting the past. It was about deciding whether the present could bear the truth. The silence that began in 1995 had grown layered, reinforced by time, habit, and institutional caution. Breaking it now would not be simple. It would require resolve, precision, and a willingness to accept that the shock would not be confined to one courtroom. Outside, Paris continued its rhythm. unaware that an old mystery was approaching a moment of irreversible tension. Inside, the prosecutors prepared for the next step, knowing that once taken, there would be no return to quiet. The next step did not arrive with drama. It arrived with paperwork, carefully worded motions, internal authorizations, signatures placed beneath clauses that acknowledged risk without naming it. Once those documents were filed, the investigation shifted from reconsideration to pursuit. Lines hardened, questions sharpened. What had been theoretical now carried consequence. Prosecutors authorized discreet surveillance, limited in scope but heavy in implication. They wanted patterns, not provocation. Movements, not reactions. The individual at the center of the inquiry remained outwardly unchanged, their routine almost stubbornly consistent. Morning departures at the same time. Familiar routes. Predictable stops. It was a life built on repetition, and repetition can be comforting, or it can be armor. Investigators watched for deviation, for signs that awareness had dawned. None came. Or if it did, it was hidden behind discipline. Parallel to this, forensic specialists revisited physical elements of the case that had once been deemed irrelevant. The apartment was gone, remodeled long ago, but photographs remained. Grainy, imperfect, yet suddenly valuable. Analysts studied shadows, reflections, the placement of objects. They looked not for evidence of struggle, but for absence, for what should have been there but wasn't. One photo showed a surface wiped clean in an otherwise untouched room. At the time, it had been interpreted as habit. Now it felt selective. The smell noted years earlier returned to the forefront. Experts consulted discreetly, offered cautious interpretations. Certain odors dissipate quickly, especially in older buildings with shared ventilation. An event could occur, brief and contained, leaving behind only a trace easily explained away. In 1995, without a reason to suspect, no one had followed that thread. Now it wove itself into the narrative, unsettling but coherent. Witnesses were brought back again, this time confronted gently with the cumulative picture rather than isolated questions. Some faltered. Others steadied themselves and spoke more freely than before. A shopkeeper admitted to noticing tension between two familiar faces days before the disappearance. A colleague recalled an argument dismissed at the time as professional stress. Each account had been too small to matter alone. Together, they sketched pressure mounting toward a breaking point. The prosecutors felt the case tightening, but also slipping. Time remained the enemy. Every witness statement was filtered through years of memory decay. Defense counsel, should charges be filed, would exploit that mercilessly. The team debated whether to move forward now or wait for something stronger. The answer came unexpectedly, from a place no one had thought to check. During a routine review of archived transportation records, an analyst flagged a minor anomaly. A late-night service entry, unremarkable on its own, aligned too closely with the disappearance to ignore. It suggested movement at an hour when official accounts insisted nothing had happened. The route passed near the building, not directly, but close enough to matter. When cross-referenced with employment logs, it intersected with the schedule of the person under scrutiny. The coincidence was thin, but persistent. This was the moment when suspicion began to feel like knowledge. Prosecutors convened late, the room quiet except for the rustle of paper and the low hum of fluorescent lights. They laid out the pieces without rhetoric. The timeline, the omissions, the witness unease, the environmental clues, the behavioral consistency that now read as calculation. No single element was decisive, but the pattern was undeniable. This was not a disappearance that had happened to someone. It was something that had been done. Still, one question dominated the room. Why had no one spoken sooner? The answer, when it came, was uncomfortable. Fear had not been dramatic. It had been practical. Fear of misjudgment. Fear of accusation without proof. Fear of being wrong in a system that punishes error more visibly than inaction. Silence had been easier. Silence had been safer. And over time, silence had hardened into normalcy. As preparations for a formal confrontation began, leaks reached the press. Not details, hints. Words like review, new elements, potential misclassification. Enough to stir speculation without committing to a narrative. The family watched the coverage with guarded intensity. They recognized the rhythm now. Anticipation followed by disappointment. Prosecutors warned them again not to expect closure. But expectations, once reignited, are difficult to restrain. The person of interest was summoned for another interview, this time under conditions that signaled escalation. They arrived composed, punctual, prepared. The conversation unfolded slowly, methodically. Prosecutors did not accuse. They asked. They revisited old answers, not to trap, but to measure response. When confronted with the transportation anomaly, there was a pause, brief, controlled, but new. It was the first visible crack. They explained it away plausibly. A change in schedule. A favor done for someone else. Nothing illegal. Nothing provable. But the explanation introduced complexity where simplicity had been their shield. Investigators noted it carefully. Complexity invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites error. After the interview, as the subject left the building and resumed their routine, prosecutors sat with a shared realization. This was no longer about discovering what happened. It was about deciding whether they could prove it without destroying the integrity of the process. A wrongful accusation would not resurrect the victim. It would only compound the harm. Then came the call that shifted everything. A former acquaintance, long out of the country, contacted authorities unsolicited. They had seen the renewed coverage. They had recognized the names. They said they could no longer stay silent. What they offered was not a confession, not direct evidence, but context so specific it could not be coincidence. A conversation remembered vividly because it had felt wrong even then. A statement that sounded like a warning disguised as concern. At the time, it had been dismissed as melodrama. Now, aligned with everything else, it felt like a final piece sliding into place. Prosecutors listened without interruption. When the call ended, the room was still. The silence felt familiar, but different. This was no longer the silence of neglect. It was the silence that precedes decision. They knew what came next would define the case, not just legally, but morally. To proceed was to challenge years of accepted narrative. To hesitate was to risk letting the truth fade again into abstraction. The shock, when it came, would not be confined to the person under suspicion. It would ripple outward, through institutions, through memory, through the city that had once looked away. As night fell over Paris, lights flickered on in windows across the city. Lives continued, unaware that an old mystery was approaching a point where restraint would give way to action. The cold case, once dormant, now burned with a quiet intensity, ready to expose not just what had happened in 1995, but how easily it had been allowed to disappear. The decision was made quietly, without ceremony. Prosecutors would move forward, not with charges, not yet, but with a formal judicial inquiry that carried teeth. It was a signal as much as a mechanism, a way of telling everyone involved that the era of passive review was over. From that moment on, every interaction would be documented, every statement weighed with intent. The case had entered a phase where mistakes could no longer hide behind time. The first consequence was immediate. Legal counsel for the person of interest requested clarification, then access, then boundaries. They framed their concern as procedural, but the undertone was unmistakable. Awareness had arrived. Investigators noted subtle changes in behavior. Routes altered slightly, conversations shortened, a new caution in public spaces. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, but no longer oblivious. The past had finally caught up with the present. Prosecutors expanded their scope carefully. They subpoenaed records once thought lost to bureaucracy, maintenance logs, building work orders, municipal archives that rarely intersect with criminal cases. It was tedious work, unglamorous and slow. But buried in those records were confirmations that aligned disturbingly well with the emerging theory. A brief service interruption, an access point temporarily unsecured, small operational details that, in isolation, meant nothing. In sequence, they suggested opportunity. The 40-minute gap was no longer an abstraction. It was mapped, populated, given texture. Investigators could now say, with increasing confidence, who had access to the building during that window, who did not, and who had reason to be there without attracting attention. The list was short, uncomfortably short. At the same time, forensic linguists reviewed transcripts of old interviews, not for content, but for structure. How questions had been asked, how answers had been framed. Patterns emerged. The person of interest had consistently volunteered information that was not requested, while avoiding elaboration where it might have mattered. It was subtle, the kind of behavior that only becomes visible when viewed across decades of consistency. Not deception in the obvious sense, but narrative management. The family was informed that the inquiry had escalated. This time, there was no attempt to soften the reality. Prosecutors spoke plainly about obstacles, about the likelihood of legal confrontation, about the possibility, still real, that the case could collapse under its own weight. The family listened in silence. When they spoke, it was not to ask for assurances, but to say they understood. They had lived with uncertainty long enough to recognize its shape. Media pressure intensified, but prosecutors held firm against speculation. They released nothing substantive, allowing rumors to outrun facts. That restraint frustrated commentators, but it protected the case. Every public word now carried legal consequence. Silence, once a failing, had become strategy. Behind closed doors, investigators prepared for the most delicate move yet, a controlled confrontation designed not to elicit confession, but to test resilience. The person of interest was invited in again, this time with less ambiguity. Prosecutors laid out fragments, not accusations, but realities that could no longer be dismissed. The transportation record, the overlapping schedules, the newly contextualized witness accounts. Each element was presented calmly, almost clinically. The reaction was measured. Denial, but not outrage. Surprise, but not confusion. The subject maintained composure, but the rhythm of their responses shifted. Pauses lengthened. Explanations grew denser. When asked about specific moments within the critical time window, answers became vague, reliant on habit rather than memory. Habit is useful until it is tested against detail. At one point, a question landed that had not been rehearsed, something drawn from the newly surfaced context provided by the overseas witness. The subject hesitated, just long enough. It was not a confession. It was not even an admission, but it was the first time uncertainty broke through the practiced surface. Investigators exchanged glances. They had seen this before. It was the sound of a narrative straining under its own weight. Still, prosecutors knew better than to rush. Pressure can produce truth, or it can produce collapse. They ended the interview deliberately early, leaving questions unanswered. Uncertainty, they believed, would do more work than accusation ever could. In the days that followed, new information surfaced quietly. A minor discrepancy in an old insurance record, a forgotten expense report, trivial things, easily explained, yet increasingly difficult to explain away collectively. The case had become cumulative. Each piece added mass, gravity. The orbit was tightening. The most unsettling development came from an unexpected quarter. A former municipal employee, retired and largely disconnected from the case, contacted investigators after recognizing a description in a news brief. They described an encounter from the mid-90s that had seemed insignificant at the time, a late request, an unusual access, a sense that protocol had been bent without explanation. They had complied, then forgotten. Now, with context, the memory resurfaced sharp and uncomfortable. That testimony filled a critical gap. It suggested facilitation, not necessarily knowing, not necessarily criminal, but enabling. The realization sent a chill through the team. Crimes rarely occur in isolation. They are often made possible by small accommodations, by people doing favors without asking why. In 1995, that culture had been invisible. Now it stood exposed. As prosecutors integrated this new account, the implications deepened. The disappearance could no longer be framed as a private act between two individuals. It had unfolded within a system that, unintentionally, had smoothed its edges. That understanding complicated everything. It widened responsibility without diluting culpability. The person of interest sensed the shift. Surveillance noted increased caution, fewer spontaneous movements, a tightening of personal circles. Friends were avoided. Conversations shortened. The armor of routine was hardening into isolation. Investigators recognized the pattern. Someone preparing, consciously or not, for impact. And yet, even now, there was no body. No definitive proof. The case remained a structure built of inference, context, and probability. Prosecutors debated endlessly whether that structure could withstand the force of a courtroom. The answer was uncertain. But uncertainty was no longer paralyzing. It was motivating. Late one evening, As files were closed and lights dimmed, a senior prosecutor lingered over the original missing person report. The language struck them anew, how neutral it had been, how carefully it had avoided alarm. That document, more than any other, symbolized the failure that had allowed the case to fade. Now, decades later, the system was trying to correct itself, knowing full well that correction does not guarantee redemption. Outside, Paris moved through another ordinary night. Streets hummed, windows glowed. Somewhere within that familiar rhythm, the past pressed against the present, demanding acknowledgement. The inquiry was no longer about whether something had happened. It was about whether the truth, delayed and fragile, could still survive the moment when it would finally be forced into the open. By the time the inquiry reached its 7th month, fatigue had settled in, not the kind that dulls urgency, but the kind that sharpens it. Everyone involved understood that the window was narrowing. Evidence does not age gracefully. Witnesses tire. Attention drifts. And yet, this was the moment when pressure, if applied correctly, could force what decades of neglect had concealed. The prosecutors began preparing for a step they had resisted until now: the formal reclassification of the case. Words carry power in law, and changing them changes everything. To move from disappearance to suspected criminal act was not symbolic, it was transformative. It would open doors that had been sealed, justify invasive measures, and signal to every observer that the state believed a line had been crossed. But it would also provoke backlash. Defense attorneys would frame it as desperation. Critics would call it revisionism. The prosecutors weighed these risks in silence, knowing hesitation carried its own cost. They returned again to the core question that haunted the case: intent. Accidents happen, conflicts erupt and dissipate. But what lingered here was not chaos, it was containment. Every new detail pointed to an event that had been controlled, limited, managed. Something had occurred that required composure afterward. That requirement narrowed the field dramatically. Panic leaves traces. Control erases them. A psychological profile was commissioned, not of a criminal act, but of the long-term behavior that followed it. Experts examined patterns of stability, risk avoidance, and narrative consistency. They noted how the person of interest had never sought distance from the event, never changed cities, never reinvented themselves. That choice was counterintuitive. Most people, burdened by guilt or fear, run. Staying suggested something else: confidence that nothing could reach them, or belief that what happened would never be questioned. Both possibilities were disturbing. Investigators quietly revisited places connected to the critical hours: cafes, transit points, shared spaces that had once been ordinary. They spoke to people who had not been questioned before, not because they had been overlooked, but because no one had thought them relevant. A bartender recalled a familiar face appearing tense that night, distracted, checking the time. A janitor remembered being asked to delay a routine task without explanation. Small memories, long dormant, resurfaced when prompted by the right questions. Each recollection tightened the narrative further. The prosecutors felt the story cohering, not into certainty, but into inevitability. The question was no longer if something had been done, but how much of it could be proven. And proof, in cases like this, is rarely a revelation. It is an accumulation until denial becomes implausible. The person of interest was summoned once more, this time with formal notice that the inquiry's scope had expanded. Their legal counsel arrived braced, prepared to contest every implication. The interview room felt different now, less exploratory, more deliberate. Prosecutors no longer asked broad questions. They asked precise ones, anchored in time and place. They referenced records the defense did not yet know existed. They observed reactions closely. Again, there was no collapse, no dramatic misstep. But the rhythm faltered. Answers lagged behind questions. Explanations grew conditional. Phrases like, "as far as I remember, I believe, it's possible." Certainty, once their shield, was thinning. At one point, when presented with the overlapping witness accounts from that critical window, the subject dismissed them as coincidence. The prosecutor responded calmly. Coincidence requires independence. These accounts were not independent. They converged. Silence followed. Not defiance. Not outrage. Just silence. That silence lingered after the interview ended. Investigators replayed it in their minds. Silence can mean many things. In this case, it felt like recalibration. Someone realizing that the story they had lived with for decades might finally be questioned in a way that mattered. Shortly after, prosecutors made the call they had been delaying. The case was formally reclassified. Internally, the language changed. Externally, the announcement was measured, careful, stripped of flourish. But the effect was immediate. Media coverage intensified, no longer speculative but anticipatory. Words like suspected homicide appeared cautiously, often paired with disclaimers. The city took notice. An old story, once relegated to footnotes, returned to the collective consciousness with unsettling force. The family received the news with mixed emotion. Relief, yes, but also dread. Reclassification meant acknowledgement, but it also meant exposure. Their private grief would now be scrutinized, dissected, broadcast. Prosecutors offered support, but they could not shield them from what was coming. Truth, when delayed, arrives loudly. Defense counsel responded predictably, issuing statements about presumption of innocence and the dangers of retrospective judgment. They questioned the reliability of aged memories, the integrity of reconstructed timelines. These arguments were expected. They were also insufficient. The prosecutors were no longer building a case on memory alone. They were building it on consistency, on the way disparate elements aligned despite the erosion of time. Behind the scenes, preparations accelerated. Warrants were drafted. Experts consulted. The possibility of search and seizure, long considered futile, was reevaluated in light of new legal framing. Prosecutors knew the odds were slim, but absence can be as revealing as presence. Sometimes what is not found speaks louder than what is. The person of interest retreated further into routine. Surveillance noted a tightening of habits, fewer deviations, fewer interactions. Isolation deepened. Friends noticed distance, but did not press. Distance, after all, is easy to explain. Investigators wondered whether this was self-protection or anticipation. Were they bracing for impact, or did they still believe the structure of the past would hold? One night, a document surfaced that crystallized the stakes. It was an internal note from the 90s, never meant for public view, referencing containment of narrative. The phrase was ambiguous, bureaucratic, but devastating in context. It suggested awareness, however vague, that the story being told publicly was being managed. Prosecutors debated its meaning fiercely. Was it about avoiding panic? About resource allocation? Or about something more specific? The ambiguity was dangerous, but it was also revealing. Even then, someone had understood that narrative mattered. That understanding reframed everything. The case was no longer just about an act committed in a private space. It was about how institutions respond when clarity threatens stability. In 1995, stability had won. Now, decades later, the balance was shifting. As prosecutors prepared for the next phase, one that would test the limits of circumstantial proof, they acknowledged the risk openly. There was no guarantee of conviction. There was no certainty of resolution. But there was clarity of purpose. The case could no longer be allowed to rest on assumptions. Outside, Paris reacted in its own way. Conversations surfaced in cafes. Old residents recalled rumors long dismissed. New residents learned the history of the walls around them. The city began to remember what it had once forgotten. And in that remembering, pressure built, not just on the person of interest, but on everyone who had benefited from silence. The cold case was no longer cold. It was volatile, charged with years of restraint finally giving way. What came next would not just answer questions about 1995. It would expose how easily truth can be postponed, and how dangerous that postponement can become when it finally ends. The moment the reclassification became public, the city didn't erupt, it tightened. Paris did what Paris always does when something ugly rises from beneath the cobblestones. It pretended to keep moving, while listening harder than before. In cafes, conversations dipped into half-whispers when the words 1995 and cold case surfaced. In offices, people skimmed headlines with a detached expression that didn't match the tension in their hands. And inside the prosecutor's building, the air changed, as if the walls themselves understood that a line had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. The investigation no longer had the luxury of slow patience. Reclassification is a flare. It draws attention, it provokes defense strategy, it puts everyone on alert, including the person under scrutiny. Prosecutors watched the news cycle the way officers watch a suspect's rearview mirror for the smallest flicker of reaction. They worried less about what was said on television and more about what would happen quietly because of it. Phone calls made. Documents moved. Old habits interrupted. Silence rearranged. The team had one goal now: force the case out of its fog and into something that could stand in court without collapsing under ridicule. That meant warrants. It meant controlled searches. It meant risking public embarrassment if nothing was found. And it meant accepting a brutal truth. If there was still evidence after all these years, it would likely exist only because someone had believed they were untouchable. They drafted the first warrant with surgical precision. Not broad, not theatrical. A targeted request based on overlapping timelines, documented opportunities, and the newly formal suspicion of criminality. Judges do not grant entry into someone's life on intuition. They demand structure. The prosecutors offered structure, thin but coherent, an architecture built from accumulation. When the authorization came back signed, it arrived like a quiet detonator placed on the table. The search was planned for early morning, before routine could become defense. Investigators moved as if they were entering a museum, not a home. Gloves, bags, cameras, silence. The person of interest was present, escorted, their lawyer close enough to mirror every breath. Their expression remained controlled, but the eyes betrayed a flicker of something: irritation, perhaps, or insult. Not fear, not panic. The calm still sat on them like tailored clothing. Inside, the rooms were clean, almost aggressively ordinary. No shrines, no hidden compartments obvious at first glance. Shelves arranged with care, paperwork stacked and labeled. A life curated to suggest nothing could ever erupt from it. Investigators moved through drawers and cabinets, not like scavengers, but like librarians hunting for one misfiled page. Every item was documented, every box photographed. The process was slow, deliberate, designed to prevent accusations of impropriety. Hours passed. The lawyer's patience thinned into sarcasm. The person of interest remained composed, occasionally offering pointed remarks about wasted resources and this obsession with the past. Prosecutors ignored it. They had learned that the past is only obsession when it threatens someone's present. Then a discovery, small enough to be missed by anyone moving too fast. In a storage area tucked behind ordinary household clutter, an old folder surfaced, its edges worn, its label faded. The content was not explosive in itself. Photocopies, clipped articles, administrative notes. But the date range punched through the room like a sudden cold draft. Mid-90s, the year of the disappearance. The person of interest watched the folder being opened with an expression that tightened for the first time into something resembling irritation. The lawyer leaned in. The prosecutors did not announce what they were thinking, but it moved between them instantly. Why would someone keep a file like that? Not a scrapbook, not a random stack. A folder, maintained, preserved. The person of interest insisted it meant nothing. Mere curiosity. They said, a public story in a public city. But the folder contained something else, a typed note, copied years ago, referencing the case with a specificity beyond what newspapers had ever published. Details that had never been public. A line about the critical time window. A phrase that matched the internal vocabulary prosecutors had seen in the newly discovered memo. Containment, narrative, simplicity. The room went still. The lawyer objected, demanded clarification, demanded to know whether the prosecutors were implying wrongdoing. The prosecutors said nothing. They didn't need to. Paper speaks louder than implication. They secured the folder, sealed it, logged it, and continued the search. And now the person of interest's composure began to show hairline fractures. Not cracks, but strain. A foot tapping once, then stopping. A jaw tightening, then relaxing. The effort of control had become visible. Investigators watched the way hunters watch a surface ripple. It's not proof of what's underneath, but it tells you something is moving. Still, no smoking gun. No miraculous piece of evidence that erased the decades. The prosecutors left the property with bags that felt too light for the weight of the investigation. But as they loaded evidence into vehicles, one of the investigators looked back at the building and felt something shift. The folder was not a conclusion, it was a direction. It suggested awareness. It suggested proximity to information the public never had. It suggested that the person of interest hadn't merely lived near the case. They had lived with it. Back at the office, the folder was examined like a relic. Forensic document specialists handled the pages, checking for annotations, fingerprints that might still exist in trace form, anything linking the material to timelines and hands. Most of it was bland. But one sheet stood out, an index-like list of names, not complete, not formal, more like a personal catalog. Some names were public. Some belonged to witnesses never publicly identified. Some belonged to investigators. And one name was circled faintly, as if someone had pressed too lightly, fearing the mark would be obvious. The circled name belonged to an officer whose involvement had never been officially documented, the one tied to that off-site interview. The same black hole, the same gap. The prosecutors stared at the circle as if it were a wound. This was no longer just about what had been missed. It was about what had been tracked, privately, by someone outside the official narrative. The question sharpened into something dangerous. Was the person of interest monitoring the investigation as it happened? And if so, why? That circle triggered a new wave of internal requests. Prosecutors demanded access to personnel rosters from the relevant precinct. They requested assignment logs. They pulled retirement records. They traced the undocumented officer's path like a thread through fabric. The officer had retired years ago, living quietly outside the city. When contacted, they responded with polite shock, too polite, too smooth. They claimed not to remember details, not after so long. They expressed sympathy. They offered nothing. But prosecutors had learned to listen not only to what people say, but to what they avoid. The former officer avoided the circled name conversation entirely, steering toward generalities. They avoided explaining why an interview would be conducted off-site. They avoided the phrase containment of narrative, pretending they had never heard it. That avoidance was not proof of corruption, but it was pressure. And pressure, applied carefully, can force hidden structures to reveal themselves. A second warrant was drafted, this time for personal archives linked to that former officer. Again, it was risky. Again, it would inflame public debate if it yielded nothing. But prosecutors were no longer hunting for a body. They were hunting for the thing that had made a body unnecessary. Control of information, manipulation of early assumptions, the quiet steering of a case toward dormancy. When the warrant was executed, it produced what the prosecutors had feared and hoped in equal measure: boxes. Old boxes, taped, labeled in handwriting that looked like the past itself. The contents were mundane: tax forms, letters, photographs, the debris of ordinary life. Then, beneath a layer of irrelevant paperwork, investigators found a cassette tape in a plain sleeve. No label, no date, just a piece of tape, preserved as if it mattered. The room went silent again. It was the same silence as the apartment in 1995, the same heavy pause before the unknown speaks. They did not play it immediately. They logged it. They sealed it. They took it to specialists, because the integrity of a case like this can be destroyed by one careless step. Hours later, in a controlled environment, they placed the cassette into an old player brought in specifically for this purpose, and they pressed play. At first, nothing but hiss. Then a faint voice, distorted by time. Two voices, actually, one familiar, one not. A conversation, low, cautious, recorded without ceremony. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a cinematic revelation. It was worse. It was administrative. It sounded like procedure. It sounded like people deciding how to interpret something that frightened them. It sounded like someone saying, in careful, bureaucratic language, that a certain interpretation would be simpler, cleaner, less disruptive. And then a line, muffled but clear enough to slice through the room. The suggestion that a narrative should be contained before it spreads. The prosecutors froze, eyes locked on each other, because that word, contained, was no longer an abstract phrase in an old memo. It was a voice, a decision, a moment where the truth, or at least the pursuit of it, had been bent. And now, as the tape clicked softly in the player and the voices continued, the team realized they were no longer just solving a cold case. They were uncovering the machinery that had kept it cold. Somewhere in that hiss and distortion, the past was speaking, and it was about to name names. The tape didn't sound like a confession. It sounded like the kind of conversation that never makes the news until it does. A low room, paper moving, someone clearing their throat. The kind of careful, bureaucratic tone people use when they believe their words will never be replayed outside the walls that protect them. The hiss of the cassette wrapped around every syllable like fog, but the message cut through anyway. Keep it simple, keep it quiet, keep the story contained. Not because they were certain of innocence, not because they had proof of anything, but because uncertainty was inconvenient. Because a narrative, once it spreads, becomes a fire no one can control. The prosecutors listened without blinking, as if blinking might interrupt what the past was finally willing to give them. Two voices. One older, measured, familiar in the way institutional speech becomes familiar. The other younger, hesitant, the tone of someone trying to obey without fully understanding what obedience might cost. Names were not spoken clearly at first. There were references, the building, the family, the file, the press, like the speakers were pointing at a thing on a table, assuming everyone in the room already knew what it was. Then a name surfaced, muffled, but there. Not the victim, not the person of interest. An internal name, a supervisor, a link. The room stayed frozen, but the case inside that room began moving faster than it ever had. The tape ended abruptly, not with a dramatic final line, but with a click that sounded like a door closing. For a moment no one spoke. Then someone exhaled, a sound that carried years of weight. The prosecutors didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. This wasn't closure. This wasn't justice. This was proof that the cold case hadn't simply fallen asleep. Someone had lowered the volume on purpose. They knew what the defense would say before the defense even knew the tape existed. They would call it ambiguous. They would call it misinterpreted. They would call it the rambling of old men in an old room. But prosecutors also knew something else. Juries understand tone. Juries understand intention. A tape like this doesn't need to name a killer to become dangerous. It only needs to reveal that the truth was steered away from daylight. Chain of custody became sacred. Every person who touched the cassette wrote their name, their time, their reason. No shortcuts, no casual handling. The prosecutors treated the tape like a live wire, because one procedural mistake would give the defense exactly what it wanted, a reason to dismiss the entire discovery as tainted. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very system accused of bending narrative in 1995 now had to prove it could handle narrative with absolute precision. They ordered audio enhancement, but not Hollywood enhancement. No miracles, just clarity. Specialists isolated frequencies, reduced hiss, sharpened consonants until words that had been ghosts became shapes. The phrase returned, cleaner now, almost cruel in its calm. Contained the narrative. The prosecutors felt the hair lift on their arms, because it sounded like policy, like habit, like a thing that had been said before. And then, tucked between those words, came another detail that hit harder than they expected. A reference to the victim's family, specifically, a suggestion that they were emotional, unpredictable, likely to push. The voice described the family not as people in pain, but as variables to be managed. The prosecutors stared at the waveform on the screen like it was an autopsy of institutional conscience. This wasn't just negligence. This was control. By morning, they had a plan. It wasn't a raid. It wasn't a public spectacle. It was a series of precise, strategic moves designed to turn the tape into leverage, not headlines. First, identify the voices. Second, connect those voices to decisions made in the file. Third, prove that the containment had consequences. Missed leads, mishandled evidence, delayed urgency. If they could build that bridge, they could argue that the case hadn't gone cold naturally. It had been cooled. They pulled personnel records like stitches. Assignments, transfers, internal memos, meeting calendars from the mid-90s. The supervisor name from the tape matched a chain of authority that fit too neatly. That person had been in position. That person had power over classification decisions. That person had relationships with the precinct handling the disappearance. And that person, according to later records, had been promoted shortly after, moving into a role where their influence widened even as their connection to the 1995 file faded from view. The prosecutors didn't rush to confront them. They waited, because confrontation without preparation is noise. They wanted the moment to be clean, deliberate, undeniable. So they built a timeline not of the disappearance, but of the response. When the missing report came in, when it was downgraded in urgency, when witnesses were dismissed, when the interview was conducted off-site, and then erased from documentation. When the early theory of voluntary disappearance hardened into default, every step aligned with one simple principle. If you decide the story early, the evidence must either support it or be ignored. As the new timeline formed, another ripple began. Quiet, human, unpredictable. A former clerk who had worked in the prosecutor's office in the 90s came forward, not because they wanted attention, but because they were afraid the story being told now would still miss the most important part. They remembered a meeting. Not the details, not the words, but the atmosphere. The way voices dropped when someone entered, the way papers were moved quickly, the way the file was spoken about as a problem rather than a tragedy. They didn't remember names. They remembered fear. Fear of scandal. Fear of political consequences. Fear of appearing incompetent. The prosecutors listened and took notes, not because the clerk's memory would win a case on its own, but because it matched the tape's tone. It matched the logic of containment. It matched the way institutions behave when the truth threatens to embarrass them. Meanwhile, the person of interest, the one whose routine had begun tightening into isolation, kept living their life under a sky that was growing darker. Surveillance noted changes. Curtains drawn earlier. Fewer casual stops. A new habit of checking behind them at intersections, subtle, practiced, like someone scanning without wanting to seem like they're scanning. Prosecutors didn't interpret it as guilt. They interpreted it as awareness. The case had become public enough that anyone with a reason to worry would now feel the air shifting. Then came the first actual crack in the wall of silence, and it didn't come from the suspect. It came from someone adjacent. Someone who had been close enough to sense pressure, but not so close they felt protected by it. A relative of the person of interest requested to speak with investigators, privately, without lawyers, without cameras. They didn't offer a dramatic allegation. They offered a confession of a different kind, that they had lived for years with a feeling they couldn't name, a quiet dread that something about 1995 was not what it seemed. They described odd remarks made late at night, years ago, comments that sounded like disdain for the victim's family, annoyance at people who won't let things go, irritation that the city doesn't understand how things work. It wasn't direct admission. It was a portrait of attitude. And attitude, prosecutors knew, can hint at motive. Not rage, but contempt. Not violence, but entitlement. The relative also mentioned something small, almost absurdly small, an old key. A key that had been kept long after it should have been discarded, hanging on a ring with others, rarely used, but never removed. They couldn't say what it opened. They had never asked. They only remembered the key because it had once been the subject of a strange argument. An argument about getting rid of things, about not leaving traces, about never throwing away what might matter. The prosecutors felt their pulse shift. Keys are mundane. Keys are also access. And access was the spine of this case. They asked for the key. The relative hesitated, then agreed to help. They didn't want to be seen as betraying family, but they wanted the truth to stop stalking them. The prosecutors arranged a controlled handover, documented and sealed, not because the key was guaranteed to be anything, but because the act of producing it itself mattered. It showed that silence was no longer absolute. It showed that the case had begun to pull people away from old loyalties. When the key arrived, it was worn, anonymous, the kind of object that could open 1,000 doors. Specialists examined it. They looked for markings, for manufacturer patterns, for clues in the grooves. They compared it against archived building keys, municipal systems, storage locks used in the 90s. Each comparison was a long shot. But long shots are all cold cases have. And in this case, long shots had already produced a cassette that should never have existed. As prosecutors worked, they felt the investigation stretching towards something larger than a single suspect. The tape pointed upward into authority. The key pointed sideways into access. The witness accounts pointed inward into routine spaces where crimes can be committed without spectacle. Every direction suggested the same truth. This case was never just about what happened to one person. It was about how a disappearance can be made to look ordinary, and how ordinary people can become part of that machinery by choosing not to see. The next confrontation, they decided, would not be with the person of interest alone. It would be with the structure around them. The former supervisor, the undocumented officer, the internal culture that had preferred containment over investigation. If the prosecutors could expose that structure, They could explain to a jury why the case had no body, no blood, no immediate chaos. Not because nothing happened, but because the aftermath had been managed. As dusk fell, Paris did what it always did. Lit up, shimmered, pretended the past was just another layer beneath the city's beauty. But inside the prosecutor's office, the past wasn't beneath anything anymore. It was on the table. It had a voice now. And with each new item sealed into evidence, the cold case was turning into something that could no longer be contained, no matter how carefully someone once tried. The key looked harmless in a gloved hand, a dull piece of metal that could belong to any life, any doorway, any forgotten drawer. But in a cold case like this, harmless objects become loaded, and every groove becomes a question. Prosecutors watch the technicians work as if they were watching surgeons, because the wrong move, one careless assumption, one overconfident conclusion, could turn a breakthrough into a courtroom disaster. The key was photographed, measured, compared under magnification. Its cuts were mapped like a fingerprint. The team didn't need it to shout. They needed it to match. They started with the obvious, the building, old lock manufacturers, archived maintenance invoices. A retired concierge from the mid-90s, reached by phone, remembered the way keys used to be stamped, the way duplicates were controlled, until they weren't. The concierge's voice carried the same weary tone prosecutors had heard from so many others. Back then, it was easier to make things work than to make them correct. People lent keys. People copied keys. People forgot to return keys, and no one chased them, because chasing them would mean admitting the system was porous. Porous systems are convenient until a person disappears inside them. The key didn't match the building's standard blanks. That should have been disappointing, but it wasn't. It was information. It meant the key belonged to something else, something separate from the victim's front door, something not directly tied to that apartment's daily routine. Investigators expanded the search: storage units, municipal service cabinets, secondary entrances, basement cages. Places that exist in cities like Paris as invisible architecture, spaces no one thinks about until they need to hide something, move something, access something quietly. Meanwhile, the cassette tape became the beating heart of the inquiry. Audio enhancement continued, layer by layer, until the voices gained sharper edges. Analysts isolated patterns of speech, cadence, vocal tics. The goal wasn't just to understand words. It was to identify who had spoken them. Prosecutors compared the tape against archival recordings, training videos, official statements, even local radio interviews from the era. It was painstaking, borderline obsessive. But obsession is what cold cases require. The tape wasn't just evidence. It was a doorway into the machinery that had kept the case frozen. When the voice profile suggested a match to the former supervisor referenced in personnel records, prosecutors didn't celebrate. They braced. Because matching a voice is one thing. Proving that the person behind it had directed decisions that harmed an investigation is another. And accusing someone with institutional authority, someone whose career had been built inside the system, meant stepping into a storm. They arranged the meeting carefully. Not a raid, not a public summons, but an official interview under formal conditions that made refusal difficult. The former supervisor arrived dressed like someone who had not expected to be questioned by the past. Polite, controlled, faintly offended. Their eyes moved over the room with professional familiarity, the look of someone who had sat on the other side of tables like this, asking questions, shaping narratives, deciding which truths would be prioritized and which would be delayed until they became harmless. Prosecutors began gently, laying out the timeline as it had been known in 1995. The supervisor nodded at the appropriate moments, offered small corrections, almost eager to show mastery. Then the prosecutors introduced the new timeline, the version that included gaps, omissions, the off-site interview, the missing documentation, the internal language of containment. The supervisor's expression tightened subtly, as if the room temperature had shifted. They played a short excerpt from the tape. Not the whole thing, just enough. The supervisor did not flinch dramatically. There was no cinematic denial. Instead, there was a pause so controlled it felt practiced. Then came the expected defenses: memory unreliable, context missing, voices indistinct, bureaucratic phrases misinterpreted. It was all reasonable on the surface. But prosecutors weren't looking for drama. They were looking for alignment. And the alignment was already there. In the way the supervisor avoided answering directly whether the phrase contained the narrative had ever been used in that office. They asked about the off-site interview. The supervisor claimed not to recall it. Prosecutors showed the handwritten note referencing it, the circled name in the folder, the chain of authority that placed the supervisor close enough to know. Still, the supervisor stayed calm, expressing regret about documentation issues and the chaos of caseloads in those years. It was the language of institutional fog. No one person responsible, only circumstances, only volume, only inevitable imperfection. Then the prosecutor asked a question that wasn't about the disappearance at all. It was about fear. Fear of scandal. Fear of headlines. Fear of public panic. The supervisor's eyes hardened. "We were responsible for maintaining order," they said, as if it were an explanation that should satisfy any moral concern. That sentence landed like a weight. Order. Not truth. Not justice. Order. The prosecutors felt the case shift again, not forward, but deeper, into motive. Because if the system's motive had been order, then containment wasn't a metaphor. It was policy. After the interview, prosecutors didn't leak what had been said. They didn't have to. The media already smelled blood in the water, and restraint was now their greatest weapon. Instead, they moved quietly, building what they needed: corroboration, paper trails, meeting schedules, any record that could place the supervisor in the room when the tape was recorded. A breakthrough came from an unglamorous source: a calendar. A physical desk calendar preserved in an archive box, the kind of thing most people throw away without thinking. It belonged to the undocumented officer, the one tied to the off-site interview and the cassette's existence. The calendar contained shorthand notes, initials, and a single entry on the date that matched the tape's likely recording window, R, followed by a location code prosecutors recognized as a conference room designation used at the time. A small note beside it read, faintly, "Press risk. Press risk." It was the first time the fear named itself in ink. The prosecutors felt the pressure tighten around the entire structure. The cassette wasn't a lone anomaly. It was part of a pattern, a meeting to evaluate risk, a decision to simplify, a choice to frame the disappearance as voluntary rather than suspicious. Each step would now be argued not as incompetence, but as prioritization of calm over urgency, stability over scrutiny. That argument wouldn't just affect a suspect. It would echo through the system itself. The person of interest, meanwhile, had grown visibly more guarded. Surveillance noted a new behavior: late-night drives with no clear destination, looped routes, stops made briefly and then abandoned. It wasn't enough to call it evasion, but it was enough to call it agitation. Prosecutors debated whether to intervene or watch. Intervention might push them into mistakes. Watching might allow them to move something, destroy something, disappear something. The past had already taught them the cost of waiting too long. They decided on a middle path: controlled pressure. A formal notice was served that additional searches were being considered as part of the escalating inquiry. It was a legal move, but also a psychological one. It told the person of interest that the walls were closing, that routine was no longer protection. The reaction was subtle but immediate: fewer outings, more phone calls, a clear increase in tension visible even through the distance of surveillance. Then the key came back into focus. A locksmith consultant identified the key blank pattern as consistent with certain municipal storage locks used in the 90s, especially in older buildings that had been retrofitted for maintenance access. The match wasn't definitive, but it narrowed the field. Prosecutors cross-referenced municipal work orders around the victim's building and neighboring properties from that period. They found a cluster of entries involving basement access and ventilation work, small jobs, routine jobs, scheduled in the weeks surrounding the disappearance. One work order referenced an emergency access request late in the evening, approved unusually quickly, signed off under a chain of authority that included the same supervisory branch connected to the tape. The room went cold in a way no heater could fix. They pursued the location tied to the work order: a municipal storage corridor beneath a nearby building, an unremarkable place that smelled of dust and old concrete, the kind of space where the city hides its own infrastructure. A warrant was obtained. The search team entered with careful precision, documenting every lock, every latch, every corner. The key was tested, not with hope, but with discipline, each attempt recorded. When the key turned in the lock, smoothly, without resistance, the sound was almost obscene in its simplicity. The door opened onto a narrow compartment. Shelves, aging containers, forgotten supplies. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. For a moment, it seemed like another dead and dressed up as momentum. Then an investigator noticed a container tucked behind others, placed too far back to be routine. It was sealed, dusted, unlabeled. The kind of thing that shouldn't exist in an inventory-driven space. They pulled it forward. The seal was intact, but the container itself was newer than everything around it, as if it had been placed there later, retrofitted into an older environment. Prosecutors felt their breath slow, their minds moving faster than their bodies. The defense would call this coincidence. The public would call it sensational. The truth would depend on what was inside, and whether it could be tied to 1995 without contaminating the present. They secured the container, logged it, transported it under strict chain of custody to a controlled lab environment. No one opened it in the corridor. No one made a face for the cameras. This was not theater. This was evidence. Hours later, under bright lights and silent observation, specialists prepared to break the seal. Prosecutors watched through glass, the same way families watch surgeons in waiting rooms, powerless, aching, braced for either nothing or everything. The technician lifted the lid slowly, methodically, as if the air itself could be evidence. And just before the contents were fully visible, the prosecutor's phone buzzed with a message from an internal security liaison. The media had somehow learned about the municipal search. A crew was already outside. Questions were coming. Pressure was rising. And somewhere, in the city's endless network of listening ears, someone else might be hearing it too. Inside the lab, the lid opened the final centimeter. The technicians paused. Their expressions changed. The prosecutor's heartbeat became an audible thing in their own skull, because they knew that whatever lay inside that container was about to decide whether the cold case had been contained by incompetence or by design. And outside, Paris kept moving, unaware that in a sealed room under fluorescent lights, the past had finally produced something that could no longer be explained away. The lid opened the final centimeter, and for a heartbeat the room felt airless, as if even the fluorescent lights had leaned in to watch. The technicians didn't gasp, didn't recoil, didn't give the kind of reaction tabloids crave. Their expressions simply changed, tightened, sharpened, like professionals recognizing an object that should not exist. Inside the container was not horror. It was worse. It was intention. A sealed evidence pouch sat on top, yellowed but intact, the kind used in the mid-90s, stamped with an inventory code that made everyone in the room instinctively look at each other. Beneath it were personal items arranged with a carefulness that felt almost ceremonial. A worn leather wallet, a small ring of keys, a transit card from that era, and a watch stopped at a time that instantly became a question. The items weren't scattered like trash. They were placed, curated, preserved, as if someone had wanted them to survive, even if the person they belonged to did not. A prosecutor stepped closer to the glass, eyes locked on the pouch's label. The ink was faded, but legible enough to punch through decades. A name. The victim's name. A date. A date that should have been in the file. A date that, officially, had never existed. Behind the pouch, folded papers, thin, official, bureaucratic, rested in a plastic sleeve. A printed report header from a Paris precinct. A short paragraph. A signature line. And across the top, one word that made the prosecutor's throat go dry. Reclassified. The document was never supposed to leave an archive. It was never supposed to be real. And yet here it was, buried under a neighboring building in a municipal storage compartment, protected by a lock that only one old key seemed to open. In the hallway outside the lab, phones began ringing like alarms. The internal security liaison's warning had been correct. Journalists had arrived. Vans, cameras, microphones already held up to anyone in a suit. Social media was ahead of the broadcast networks, feeding the city rumors faster than facts could catch them. Paris 1995 cold case. Prosecutors raid municipal tunnel. Hidden evidence discovered. Shock in the justice system. Words that sounded like headlines from another country, another era, now belonged to them. The prosecutors didn't move like people savoring a breakthrough. They moved like people handling a live device. The container's contents had to be secured, logged, duplicated in documentation, verified by chain of custody, so tight it could survive an army of defense attorneys and a public that wanted drama more than procedure. Every item was photographed in place before it was touched. Every touch was documented. Every shift in position written down like scripture. Because if the truth was finally here, it would be fragile, and fragile truths get murdered in court. They opened the evidence pouch under controlled conditions, and the first thing that fell into view was a smaller bag, an older one, with a handwritten note inside. The note was brief. A few lines, ink pressed hard, as if written by someone trying to control their own shaking hand. It referenced the off-site interview, the interview that had never existed in the official record. It included a time, a location code, the same press risk shorthand that had appeared on the retired officer's desk calendar. It was not a confession, but it was a map of fear. The technicians laid the note beside the report, and suddenly a pattern became impossible to deny. This container wasn't an accident. It wasn't lost property. It was a private archive of a decision. What to keep, what to hide, what to store away from the file so the file could remain simple. The prosecutors felt something tighten in their chest. Not victory, not satisfaction, but anger. The kind of anger that has nowhere to go because it's aimed at a system, not a single face. They turned to the wallet. It was old, but not destroyed. Cards inside were dated, expired, yet unmistakably the victim's. A photograph tucked behind a plastic sleeve. A faint smell of leather that had survived time better than truth had. A transit card with tiny scratches along the edge. All of it proof of one terrifying thing. The victim's belongings had been in someone else's possession, controlled, held back from the family, held back from the case, held back from justice. One prosecutor whispered the words that had become the spine of the investigation, contained narrative. And in the sterile lab light, that phrase stopped being abstract. It became physical. Outside, the press surged. The prosecutors refused interviews, issued a single short statement about ongoing investigative measures, and disappeared back inside like people escaping a storm. They knew the city would feed on the silence. But they also knew silence, in this moment, was the only way to keep the evidence alive. By late afternoon, the person of interest was brought in again, this time under conditions that were no longer polite. Not arrested, not charged, but summoned with a gravity that could be felt in the air before any words were spoken. Their lawyer arrived first, already aggressive, already framing the narrative as a witch hunt fueled by media hysteria. When the person of interest entered, their face was composed, but their eyes flicked once toward the prosecutor's folder, toward the thickness of it, toward the weight of the paper that hadn't been there before. The prosecutors didn't accuse. They placed photographs on the table instead, the container, the items, the victim's wallet, the reclassification report. They watched the person's expression for impact, for confusion, for the smallest microfracture in the armor of routine. The person of interest stared at the images longer than necessary, and then spoke carefully, like a person walking across thin ice. They said they had never seen those items. They said they didn't know what municipal storage corridors were. They said the case was infected by fantasy. But the prosecutors had learned that fantasy collapses when it meets detail. They asked about the key. They asked about access. They asked about the supervisor's voice on the cassette. They asked about press risk. They asked why the victim's name appeared on a document that had never been filed. Each question landed with clean edges, and each answer came back less clean, more conditional, more crowded with explanation. The lawyer interrupted constantly. The person of interest leaned on polite indignation like a crutch. Then the prosecutor played a short excerpt from the tape, the clearest, most enhanced segment, just enough for a phrase to cut through the room, contain the narrative. The sound of it changed everything. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a voice that had existed in time. The person of interest didn't flinch, but their breathing changed, just slightly, a barely visible rise in the chest. Their lawyer spoke fast, too fast, objecting not to the content, but to the implication that the prosecutors were presenting it as fact. The prosecutor responded with the calm of someone who had been waiting to say this for years. The tape is not a conclusion. The container is not a conclusion. But together they show something the defense cannot erase. Someone had chosen to move evidence away from the official file. Someone had chosen to keep the story quiet. Someone had chosen to delay urgency until urgency died. The person of interest's composure held, but the room had changed. The questions were no longer about the victim's disappearance. They were about who had been powerful enough to decide how that disappearance would be framed, who had benefited, who had been protected, and the person of interest, whether guilty or not, was now standing in the center of a structure that looked less like coincidence and more like design. The prosecutors expanded outward again because the case was no longer a straight line. It was a web. They reopened internal investigations into the former supervisor. They demanded explanations for missing documentation. They audited archives. They found more minor inconsistencies, small, almost laughable bureaucratic errors. Except now they all leaned in the same direction, away from alarm, away from scrutiny, away from truth. The family was brought in that night, not for a press moment, not for a staged reveal, for a private meeting, because certain things should never be performed. When the prosecutor placed the victim's wallet on the table, the family didn't scream. They didn't collapse. They did something quieter, something that hurt more to witness. They stared at it as if it were a ghost, as if it had traveled decades to land there and prove that their loved one had been real all along, not just a story trapped in a file. The family touched the leather carefully, like touching it might make the past speak. Someone whispered the victim's name as if calling them back into the room. The prosecutors watched and felt the case's true weight settle. Not the weight of legal strategy, but the weight of years stolen, of mornings spent waiting for a phone call that never came, of birthdays that passed with an empty chair and an unresolved ache. And still, there was no body, no final certainty, no clean ending. The container proved preservation, manipulation, control. It did not prove the final act. It did not locate the victim. It did not give the family the one thing they had been denied for decades, an ending they could hold. That is what made the case so terrifying. It was a cold case not because time had erased everything, but because someone had built a freezer around it. Layers of caution, fear of headlines, obsession with order, professional self-protection disguised as pragmatism. The city had not simply failed to see. The city had been encouraged, gently, bureaucratically, to stop looking. In the days that followed, Paris became a different kind of loud. Not sirens, not protests. The loudness of suspicion. The loudness of neighbors revisiting old memories and wondering if they had walked past truth without recognizing it. The loudness of a justice system forced to stare at its own reflection and admit that sometimes the most dangerous evidence isn't hidden under floorboards. It's hidden in decisions, in phrases, in meetings where someone says simpler and means safer, where someone says contain and means bury. The prosecutors returned to their desks each night with the same unresolved question pulsing under everything. If evidence had been stored, curated, protected, what else had been moved? What else had been controlled? And if someone had been confident enough to keep a victim's belongings for years, confident enough to keep a secret in a municipal corridor, then that confidence had to come from somewhere. From power, from proximity, from a belief that the truth, like the victim, could be made to disappear. The cold case was no longer cold. It was exposed, bleeding light into places that had been dark for decades. And yet the ending remained just out of reach, like footsteps heard in a stairwell that no one can find the source of, like a door left ajar on a quiet morning in 1995, inviting the city to look inside, and forcing it, finally, to admit that the silence was never empty at all.